The morning sun cast long shadows across the placid waters of Pearl Harbor as Seaman First Class Robert Mitchell adjusted his binoculars on the deck of the USS Arizona. It was Sunday, December 7, 1941, and the 20-year-old sailor from Kansas had been looking forward to a rare day of rest. The harbor stretched before him like a mirror, reflecting the towering masts of America's Pacific Fleet in perfect formation. Battleship Row stood as a testament to American naval might, with 8 massive warships anchored in peaceful slumber. Mitchell had joined the Navy 18 months earlier, driven by a sense of adventure and the promise of seeing the world beyond his family's wheat farm. Like countless young men of his generation, he had grown up during the Great Depression, watching his parents struggle to keep food on the table while dust storms ravaged the plains. The military offered stability, purpose, and a chance to serve something greater than himself. At 7:48 that morning, Mitchell noticed something unusual on the horizon. Small dots were approaching from the north, moving with purpose across the azure sky. His training kicked in as he reached for the ship's communication system, but before he could sound an alarm, the first wave of Japanese aircraft descended like metallic birds of prey. Commander Mitsuo Fukuda led the attack from his Nakajima bomber, surveying the target below with cold precision. The Japanese had spent months planning this assault, studying intelligence photographs, and rehearsing every detail. Their objective was clear: cripple the American Pacific Fleet and prevent any interference with Japan's expansion across Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. The first bombs fell at 7:55, shattering the Sunday morning calm with thunderous explosions that could be heard across Oahu. Mitchell watched in horror as the USS Oklahoma took a direct hit, her massive hull shuddering under the impact. Sailors poured from below decks, many still in their sleeping clothes, scrambling to reach battle stations that had never been tested under real fire. Ensign Joseph Taussig Jr., barely 23 years old and fresh from the Naval Academy, was having breakfast aboard the USS Nevada when the attack began. The young officer from Missouri had dreamed of naval service since childhood, inspired by stories of his grandfather's Civil War heroics. As explosions rocked the harbor, Taussig rushed to his post, his mind racing to process what seemed impossible. America was under attack on its own soil. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. These young men, raised on stories of American invincibility and geographic isolation, suddenly found themselves thrust into a global conflict they had only read about in newspapers. The attack lasted just under 2 hours, but in that brief span, it transformed an entire generation from peacetime citizens into warriors forged by fire. As the morning progressed and the magnitude of the devastation became clear, Mitchell, Taussig, and thousands of their comrades faced a stark reality. The world they had known was gone forever, replaced by one where American soil was no longer safe from foreign attack. The greatest generation's defining moment had begun not with their victory, but with their awakening to the true cost of freedom. The acrid smell of burning oil and twisted metal filled the air as pharmacist's mate third-class John Bradley crawled through the smoke-filled corridors of the USS Arizona. The 21-year-old medic from Wisconsin had been attending Sunday Mass when the first bomb struck. Now, barely 30 minutes later, he found himself in hell, desperately searching for survivors trapped in the ship's lower decks. Bradley's hands shook as he bandaged the severe burns of Seaman Tommy Harrison, a 19-year-old gunner's mate from Tennessee. Harrison's face was barely recognizable, his youth stolen in an instant by the searing flames that had engulfed his battle station. As Bradley worked, he could hear Harrison whispering prayers his grandmother had taught him, the same words that had comforted generations of his family through hardship. Above them, Lieutenant Commander Samuel Fuqua fought to maintain order amid the chaos. The 37-year-old damage control officer had served in the Navy for 15 years, but nothing had prepared him for the apocalyptic scene unfolding around him. The Arizona's forward magazines had exploded at 8:06, lifting the massive battleship's bow completely out of the water before slamming it back down in a twisted ruin of steel and fire. Fuqua moved through the wreckage with determined purpose, organizing rescue efforts and ensuring that wounded sailors reached safety. His calm leadership in those crucial moments would later earn him the Medal of Honor, But at the time, he was simply doing what needed to be done. The young men under his command looked to him for guidance, and he refused to let them down. According to historical records from the National Archives, over 1,100 sailors and Marines perished aboard the USS Arizona that morning, making it the single greatest loss of life during the Pearl Harbor attack. Across the harbor, aviation machinist mate First Class Donald Ross faced his own trial by fire aboard the USS Nevada. The 27-year-old mechanic from Kansas had been working in the ship's forward engine room when the attack began. Despite suffering severe burns and smoke inhalation, Ross remained at his post, maintaining steam pressure that allowed the Nevada to get underway, the only battleship to do so during the attack. Ross's dedication exemplified the spirit that would come to define his generation. Raised during the Depression, these young men understood sacrifice and duty in ways that prosperity had never taught. They had learned to endure hardship, to put community before self, and to find strength in collective purpose. These lessons, learned in wheat fields and factory towns across America, now serve them in the crucible of war. As the second wave of Japanese aircraft arrived at 8:54, the Americans began to fight back with increasing effectiveness. Anti-aircraft guns that had been silent during the initial surprise now filled the sky with defensive fire. Young sailors who had never fired a shot in anger found themselves manning weapons with deadly purpose, their training overriding their fear. Seaman First Class Vernon Luke, an 18-year-old from rural Mississippi, had joined the Navy to escape poverty and find adventure. Now, as he fed ammunition to a 5-inch gun crew aboard the USS Pennsylvania, he discovered that adventure came with a price he had never imagined. The faces of his fallen shipmates would haunt his dreams for decades to come, but in that moment, he focused solely on his duty. The attack had transformed these young Americans from observers of world events into active participants in history's greatest conflict. They had entered the morning as individuals with personal dreams and ambitions. They emerged as members of a generation bound together by shared trauma and common purpose. The fires of Pearl Harbor had begun forging the greatest generation's character, tempering their resolve in ways that would shape the remainder of the 20th century. In the immediate aftermath of the attack, as smoke billowed across Pearl Harbor like a funeral shroud, 22-year-old Ensign George Welch stood among the wreckage of what had been America's most powerful naval base. The young pilot from Delaware had managed to get his P-40 Warhawk airborne during the attack, shooting down 4 Japanese aircraft in a display of courage that would earn him the Distinguished Service Cross. Now, as he surveyed the devastation, Welch understood that his generation faced a defining choice: surrender to despair or rise to meet history's challenge. The human cost was staggering. 2,403 Americans had died in less than 2 hours, with another 1,178 wounded. The Pacific Fleet lay in ruins, with 18 ships sunk or severely damaged. The psychological impact was even more profound. America's sense of invulnerability had been shattered, replaced by a grim understanding that freedom required constant vigilance and sacrifice. Captain Mervyn Benyon, the 47-year-old commanding officer of the USS West Virginia, had been mortally wounded early in the attack but refused to abandon his post. As he lay dying on his ship's bridge, the Utah native continued issuing orders to save his vessel and crew. His final words, spoken to Yeoman First Class Ronald Endicott, were about getting the ship's guns into action. "Keep firing, boys. We'll show them what Americans can do." Benyon's sacrifice resonated deeply with the young sailors who witnessed it. They had seen their captain choose duty over self-preservation, demonstrating the values that would come to define their generation's response to the war. Death held no terror for men who understood that some things were worth dying for: freedom, democracy, and the right of future generations to live without fear. The news of Pearl Harbor spread across the American mainland like wildfire. In small towns and major cities, Americans gathered around radios to hear President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's address to Congress on December 8th. His words, yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, galvanized a nation that had been deeply divided about entering the European War. 20-year-old James Doolittle Jr., son of the famous aviator, was attending college in California when he heard the news. Like millions of his contemporaries, he immediately understood that his life had changed forever. The comfortable certainty of peacetime America was gone, replaced by the urgent necessity of total war. Within days, he would join the flood of young men heading to recruitment offices across the country. Historical documentation from the Smithsonian Institution reveals that military recruitment increased by over 300% in the week following Pearl Harbor, as young Americans rushed to serve their country. The attack had created a unique generational bond among those who lived through it. Whether they had been at Pearl Harbor or had heard about it on the radio, young Americans shared a common understanding of what was at stake. They had seen what happened when free nations failed to prepare for aggression, and they were determined not to repeat that mistake. Marine Private First Class James Whitmore, an 18-year-old from Ohio who had been stationed at Pearl Harbor's Marine Barracks, spent the days following the attack helping to recover bodies from the sunken ships. The gruesome work aged him beyond his years, but it also strengthened his resolve. Each fallen sailor represented someone's son, brother, or husband. Men who had died defending their country on what should have been a peaceful Sunday morning. The greatest generation's character was being forged in these moments of stark choice. They could have allowed fear and despair to paralyze them, but instead they chose action. They could have blamed their leaders for the intelligence failures that made Pearl Harbor possible, but instead they focused on preventing future attacks. They could have sought comfort in isolation, but instead they embraced the global responsibility that came with being the world's most powerful democracy. As 1941 drew to a close, these young Americans prepared for a war that would test every value they held dear. They had been awakened to the true cost of freedom, and they were ready to pay it. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Corporal Daniel Hayes crouched in a foxhole on the Philippine island of Bataan, his rifle trained on the jungle that concealed advancing Japanese forces. The 23-year-old Marine from Nebraska had been among the reinforcements rushed to the Pacific following the attack, part of a desperate attempt to halt Japanese expansion across Southeast Asia. The young man, who had once worried about finding work during the Depression, now faced challenges that would have been unimaginable to his peacetime self. Hayes represented thousands of young Americans who had enlisted in the weeks following Pearl Harbor, driven by a mixture of patriotic fury and grim determination. They had grown up hearing stories of the Great War from their fathers and uncles, but those tales had seemed like ancient history. Now they were creating their own legend, written in blood and sacrifice across the far reaches of the Pacific Ocean. The Bataan Peninsula had become a symbol of American resistance in the face of overwhelming odds. General Douglas MacArthur's forces, consisting largely of Filipino troops and American advisors, held out for nearly 4 months against a superior Japanese army. Among them was Lieutenant Robert Lapham, a 25-year-old West Point graduate from Illinois who had arrived in the Philippines just weeks before the war began. Lapham had dreamed of a peacetime military career, perhaps rising through the ranks during the long intervals between conflicts that had characterized American military service for decades. Instead, he found himself thrust into a desperate struggle for survival, leading Filipino guerrilla fighters in hit-and-run attacks against Japanese supply lines. The leadership skills he had learned in the classroom were tested daily in life-and-death situations. The fall of Bataan in April 1942 marked one of the darkest moments in American military history. Over 76,000 Allied troops were captured, including nearly 12,000 Americans. The subsequent Bataan Death March became a symbol of Japanese brutality and American endurance, as prisoners were forced to walk 65 miles in tropical heat with minimal food or water. Staff Sergeant William Dias, a 25-year-old pilot from Texas, was among those who survived the march and the prison camps that followed. His experiences, later documented in his memoir, revealed the depths of human cruelty and the heights of human courage. Dias observed how his fellow prisoners drew strength from their shared identity as Americans, maintaining discipline and hope even in the face of systematic torture and starvation. Military historians at the U.S. Army Center of Military History have documented that the Bataan Death March resulted in the deaths of approximately 600 to 700 American prisoners and 5,000 to 18,000 Filipino prisoners. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, other members of the greatest generation were preparing for their own trials. Aviation radioman Second Class Bruno Gato, a 21-year-old from Missouri, served aboard the USS Enterprise during the Doolittle Raid on Tokyo in April 1942. The daring bombing mission, led by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, demonstrated America's ability to strike at the Japanese homeland and provided a crucial morale boost for the American people. Gato had joined the Navy before Pearl Harbor, motivated by economic necessity rather than patriotic fervor. His family had struggled during the Depression, and military service offered steady pay and the chance to learn valuable skills. The attack on Pearl Harbor transformed his service from a job into a calling, as he understood that he was fighting not just for his own future, but for the survival of democratic ideals. The war was changing these young Americans in fundamental ways. They were learning that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. They discovered that leadership emerged from character rather than rank, as they witnessed both officers and enlisted men rise to meet extraordinary challenges. Most importantly, they were developing an unshakable faith in their cause and in each other. By mid-1942, the initial shock of Pearl Harbor had given way to grim determination. The young men who had rushed to enlist in the wake of the attack were now seasoned veterans, hardened by combat and unified by shared sacrifice. They had proven themselves in the crucible of war, earning the right to be called the greatest generation not through propaganda, but through their actions on battlefields across the globe. The transformation was complete. A generation of Americans had evolved from Depression-era survivors into the warriors who would ultimately triumph in history's greatest conflict. The pre-dawn darkness of June 4, 1942, enveloped the USS Yorktown as Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey prepared for what would become one of the most decisive battles in naval history. The 38-year-old dive bomber squadron leader from Buffalo had been flying combat missions since Pearl Harbor, but the upcoming engagement at Midway would test every skill he had learned and every ounce of courage he possessed. McCluskey represented the evolution of the greatest generation from shock survivors to seasoned warriors. 6 months of combat had transformed young Americans who had never imagined leaving their hometowns into hardened veterans capable of carrying the war to their enemies. The lessons learned at Pearl Harbor about preparedness, sacrifice, and the true cost of freedom now guided their actions in the Central Pacific. The Battle of Midway marked a turning point not just in the war, but in the confidence of American forces. Intelligence breakthroughs had given Admiral Chester Nimitz advance warning of Japanese plans, allowing him to position his limited forces for maximum effect. This time, unlike at Pearl Harbor, the Americans would not be caught by surprise. Ensign George Gay, a 29-year-old torpedo bomber pilot from Texas, flew with Torpedo Squadron 8 from the USS Hornet. Gay had grown up during the depths of the Depression, watching his father struggle to keep their small farm afloat while drought and economic hardship devastated the region. That experience had taught him perseverance in the face of overwhelming odds, a lesson that would serve him well in the skies over Midway. As the battle unfolded, Gay's squadron faced a suicide mission against the Japanese carrier fleet. Flying obsolete TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, they attacked without fighter escort, knowing that their chances of survival were minimal. Of the 15 aircraft in the squadron, only Gay's plane survived the initial attack, and he was forced to ditch in the ocean after his aircraft was shot down. Floating in his life raft amid the Japanese fleet, Gay witnessed the turning point of the Pacific War. At 10:24 that morning, McCluskey's dive bombers found the Japanese carriers and attacked with devastating precision. Within 6 minutes, 3 enemy carriers were ablaze, their flight decks torn apart by American bombs. A 4th carrier would be sunk later that day. The young Americans who fought at Midway demonstrated the tactical evolution that had occurred since Pearl Harbor. They had learned to coordinate their attacks, to exploit enemy weaknesses, and to press home their assaults regardless of personal cost. The same generation that had been caught off guard 6 months earlier now displayed the professional competence that would characterize American military operations for the remainder of the war. Naval historians from the U.S. Naval War College have established that the Battle of Midway marked the beginning of American offensive operations in the Pacific, shifting the strategic initiative from Japan to the United States. Radio Man First Class Jack Campbell, a 24-year-old from Oregon, served aboard the USS Enterprise during the battle. Campbell had joined the Navy in 1939, motivated by a desire to see the world beyond his small coastal hometown. The attack on Pearl Harbor had given new meaning to his service, transforming it from an adventure into a sacred duty. During the battle, Campbell maintained communications between the ship and its aircraft, coordinating the attacks that would cripple the Japanese carrier fleet. His steady performance under pressure exemplified the quiet professionalism that characterized his generation's approach to war. They had learned that victory required not just courage but competence, not just determination but discipline. The aftermath of Midway revealed the psychological transformation that had occurred within the greatest generation. The young men who had been devastated by Pearl Harbor now possessed unshakable confidence in their ability to defeat any enemy. They had proven themselves in combat, earning the respect of their allies and the fear of their enemies. Lieutenant Junior Grade Richard Best, a 29-year-old dive bomber pilot from New Jersey, had delivered the fatal blow to the Japanese carrier Akagi during the battle. Best understood that Midway represented more than a tactical victory. It was proof that Americans could adapt, learn, and overcome any challenge. The generation that had been forged in the fires of Pearl Harbor was now ready to carry the war to the enemy's homeland. As 1942 progressed, these young Americans prepared for the long campaigns that would follow. They had turned the tide of war through their courage and skill, but they knew that victory would require years of additional sacrifice. The greatest generation had found its voice at Midway, and that voice would echo across the Pacific until the final Japanese surrender. August 15, 1945, found pharmacist Mate Second Class John Bradley aboard the USS Haven, a hospital ship anchored in Tokyo Bay. The same young medic who had crawled through the burning corridors of the USS Arizona nearly 4 years earlier now tended to wounded soldiers and sailors as they prepared for what everyone expected would be the costliest invasion in military history. Instead, Bradley and his shipmates listened in stunned silence as Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender over the ship's radio. The war was over, but the transformation of the greatest generation was complete. The young men who had been shocked into awareness by Pearl Harbor had endured nearly 4 years of the most devastating conflict in human history. They had fought across the Pacific from Guadalcanal to Okinawa, participated in the D-Day landings in Europe, and liberated concentration camps that revealed the true face of evil. Through it all, they had maintained their fundamental decency and their commitment to democratic values. Bradley's war had taken him from Pearl Harbor to Iwo Jima, where he had served with the 5th Marine Division during one of the bloodiest battles in Pacific theater history. On February 23, 1945, he had been among the corpsmen who helped raise the American flag on Mount Suribachi, an event immortalized in Joe Rosenthal's famous photograph. The image became a symbol of American determination and sacrifice, but for Bradley, it represented something more personal, the culmination of a journey that had begun in the smoke and flames of Pearl Harbor. The casualties of that journey were staggering. Over 400,000 Americans had died in World War II, with millions more wounded or forever changed by their experiences. Yet the greatest generation had emerged from the conflict with their fundamental character intact. They had seen the worst of human nature, but refused to become cynical. They had witnessed unspeakable horrors, but maintained their faith in progress and democracy. Colonel Paul Tibbets, the 30-year-old pilot who had commanded the Enola Gay during the atomic bombing of Hiroshima, represented the moral complexity that had defined his generation's war. The Illinois native had joined the Army Air Forces in 1937, drawn by a love of flying rather than any desire for combat. By August 1945, he was carrying weapons that could destroy entire cities, shouldering a responsibility that no previous generation had ever faced. Tibbets and his crew understood the weight of their mission. The atomic bomb was intended to end the war without the massive casualties that would have resulted from an invasion of Japan. The decision to use the weapon was made by their leaders, but the execution fell to young Americans who had been shaped by Pearl Harbor and the long years of war that followed. Documentation from the Truman Presidential Library indicates that military planners estimated that Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan, would have resulted in over 1 million American casualties. The homecoming was as complex as the war itself. Sergeant First Class Ira Hayes, a 22-year-old Pima Indian from Arizona who had also participated in the flag raising on Iwo Jima, returned to a country that struggled to understand what its young warriors had experienced. Hayes had enlisted shortly after Pearl Harbor, motivated by the same patriotic fervor that had driven millions of his contemporaries to military service. The war had made him a hero, but peace would prove to be its own challenge. Many members of the greatest generation found it difficult to discuss their wartime experiences with those who had remained on the home front. The gap between civilian and military experience had widened during the war years, creating a divide that would persist for decades. They had seen things that defied description and made decisions that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Yet they had also accomplished something unprecedented in human history. They had defeated the most powerful military forces ever assembled, liberated millions of people from tyranny, and established a new international order based on democratic principles. The young Americans, who had been awakened by Pearl Harbor, had become the leaders of the free world. As the greatest generation returned to civilian life, they carried with them the lessons learned during their years of trial. They understood that freedom was not a birthright, but a responsibility that required constant vigilance. They had learned that democracy was fragile, and that its preservation demanded the active participation of citizens who were willing to sacrifice for the common good. The attack on Pearl Harbor had been intended to cripple American resolve and force the United States to accept Japanese domination of the Pacific. Instead, it had awakened a sleeping giant and revealed the character of a generation that would reshape the world. The young Americans who had answered their country's call in its darkest hour had proven themselves worthy of the title they would carry for the rest of their lives, the greatest generation. Their legacy would endure long after the last veteran had passed away, inspiring future generations to meet their own challenges with the same courage, determination, and selfless devotion to duty that had characterized their response to Pearl Harbor and the global conflict that followed.